This book, If I Die Before I Wake, is real special to me. It's 60 years of my experience, and it's a journey. It's a journey that we all take, but we don't know about it. And this one here is a journey that I realized I was taking a long time ago. And it's something that I think everybody should really read because there's a lot in there. It has a lot of inspirational stuff. It's basically a lot of my mistakes and my joys and my successes. Okay, who am I? Well, originally I was Robert Kershaw, and I grew up in Rhode Island, and I lived kind of an interesting life. I was very, very quiet, and one of my first experiences that I had put into the book, towards the end of the book, was when I met one of the neighbors who had just moved into the house, to the neighborhood. Their son came over to me and threw the ball to me, and I threw it back at him. He smiled and ran away. So this happened a few times, and then eventually I got to know who he was. And I was so excited that I met somebody who was Chinese. It was like, I met somebody from another country. And one night I invited him over for supper, and he came over and we ate and we talked and whatnot. And my mother, after he left the house, my mother sat down with me and tried to explain to me about Mongoloidism, which is what it was called in those days, but we call it Down syndrome now. And I kind of was disappointed that he wasn't Chinese, but I understood. And I became his friend, his mentor, his protector. Every time the neighbors' kids would mess with him, I'd tell him to go run. I'd say, "Charlie, run," and then I'd get beat up. And so this went on for quite a while. And then one summer I went to camp, and when I came back, he was gone. His father was in the service and was stationed somewhere else. So I never saw him again, but what I told my mother was that I wanted to do something in my life that would stop people from treating kids like him the way he was treated. And I didn't realize I had said that. My mother told me that later on, that I had said that. But from that point on, I started some sort of a consciousness, and I don't know where it comes from. I think my father, in some ways, because he was very community-oriented. My mother was a teacher, or a teacher's aide, and she was always working with kids and stuff. So she was kind of a caregiver in that sense too. And my father worked with the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts. He got a lot of awards for doing stuff like that. And he actually was what they call a prognosticator, which means you predict the weather. And he had all kinds of ways he would predict the weather, and I have probably about 600 articles of newspapers of him predicting the weather, and they said he was pretty much 80 to 90% correct. So anyway, but I got that inquisitiveness from him, I think. And later on I decided I wanted to do something in my life to change the way people think about kids like that. So when I turned I guess I was in my senior year in high school, and I started working with a bunch of kids who were doing things with kids with disabilities. And one day there was one of the kids I was working with, or hanging out with at the time. We had a like a beach party or whatever when we were talking, and I said, "Gee, isn't it time for camp? You go to camp." And he said, "No, my brother goes to camp, but I can't." And I said, "Why can't you?" And he said, "Well, they don't take people like me." So I thought that was kind of like, really sad, and I was kind of concerned about it. So I talked to a whole bunch of the teenagers, and I started dreaming up ideas of how we could take these kids to a camp or what could we do? So within about 2 years, I created a camp called Camp Happiness, which is spelled wrong because I can't spell. And it was, even though I can't spell and it was spelled wrong, it was probably the best publicity that I could get, because people would read it and say, "Did you know your camp is spelled wrong?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And then I'd start telling them about the camp, and they would give us money, so it worked out great. But I started the camp. We had the first year of the camp, we had 30 teenagers that were counselors and whatnot. We had 2 adults involved that were basically advisors, and their job was just to advise. And I was the director, and we had 60 kids with disabilities. So here we had this for the first time in 1969, which is when you didn't do things like this. We had a camp full of 90 people that I had no idea what to do with, but we did it. And it turned out to be one of the best experiences of my life. And we just had, this year we just had our 50th reunion for the camp. So it's been around for 50 years now. So from that, I started, I was in 4-H, and I had some sort of a curiosity for a lot of different things, and mostly for people. I was fascinated by talking to people and working with people. As a lot of people say, I usually don't shut up very much, but anyway. And while I was in 4-H, there was an opportunity to go to another country as a what they called an international 4-H exchange program, and I had the opportunity to go to Brazil for a little bit over a year. And while I was there, I started, I think that was my first experience outside of the country, where I started to understand a little bit about culture, about different people. And most of my families, I would say, actually all of my families down there were Japanese. I know you're going to say, well, Japanese in Brazil. Well, yeah, Japanese in the United States too, But yeah, the families I lived with were Japanese, and part of that was because the Japanese population had a real big hold on the agricultural part of Brazil. And so all of my experiences with families there and groups and whatnot were all with the Japanese. They taught me Portuguese, which means I ended up with a Japanese accent when I spoke Portuguese, so I had to relearn Portuguese. But what I found when I was down there, I found there's a whole thing about culture shock and about culture, where when we don't understand people or we don't understand something, we're afraid of it. And especially nowadays, we see it all the time. I mean, we don't understand the Mexicans, so we're afraid of them. We don't understand the Muslims, and we're afraid of them. So, that I understand, and it's basically what I call a cultural shock. When I was down there, I was in the middle of nowhere with a whole bunch of Japanese families, and one of my host mothers was from Japan, and she was on a boat from Japan to Brazil. And the reason why she was on the boat was because she was picked out of a whole bunch of farmers to be sent to Brazil so that they could start farming in Brazil and send all the produce over to Japan, because they didn't have enough farms in Japan. And they were doing this in a lot of different countries. And so she was on a boat, and while she was on the boat, we as Americans went over there and bombed Nagasaki, which is where she came from. So her whole experience of Nagasaki, or that whole thing there, was she lost everybody she knew. And it was one of those experiences that I couldn't even fathom. But she had not a hatred for Americans, but a mistrust, and she was afraid of them. And her culture shock and my culture shock, because I found this out, and I didn't know how to deal with it. So I was in sort of a culture shock at the same time. And what I found is that we had to become caregivers at that point. So I had to kind of understand where she's coming from, and she had to try to learn where I was coming from. And what happened one day was I was in the kitchen, and they had these propane tanks in the kitchen that they use for their stoves. And I was sitting on the propane tank, and all of a sudden my host mother started laughing and giggling and just totally out of control, but she was just laughing so much. And I asked my host brother, who was a comedian too, he liked to play jokes on me, I asked him what she was laughing about, and so he went over and asked her, and he came back and he said, "You look like you're filling up the gas tank," because I was sitting on the gas tank, and that was hilarious to her. So from that point on, we were best friends, and it was just, one of those things. But what I found was that in a lot of caregiving situations, you're in the same thing. When you're a teacher, you're dealing with students. As you're the caregiver, you're dealing with students, and teachers are afraid of the students sometimes, and students are afraid of the teachers. And there has to be something there that kind of brings you together. And it's so important in situations like that, and in every situation. And what I found was, over the years, I traveled all over the country. I traveled all over Europe. On my way back from Brazil, I traveled to almost all the countries there. I got to experience all these different things in the culture and whatnot. And when I came back to the United States, I found out that I didn't know the United States that well. And I became an American living in a foreign land that was my own, and I didn't understand that. It was kind of an experience that I had a hard time with, because I had been away for over a year, living all these cultures, and coming back, and I found out the culture shock I found was, at the time, my fiance, she was a little bit older, and she looked a little different, and we were both kind of afraid of each other, so because we didn't know how much we had changed. And also my brother was about almost a foot taller than he used to be, so he wasn't my little brother anymore, he was my bigger brother. And so all these different things, and I found going through that experience set me up for learning how to deal with all these different situations that I've been in all my life, and especially caregiving. That's one. But what I try to do with the caregiving, because I lived in New York, I've lived all over the place. I've worked on Broadway. I was a truck driver for a while. I've had all these experiences that I have in the past, and I look back at it, and the main thing that I found in looking back was that everything we do, we're leaving a legacy. I'm leaving a legacy with you right now. You're leaving a legacy with me if you're talking to me. When you go to the grocery store and you buy your groceries, if you're angry and you're upset because it's too expensive, or and you say something nasty to the person at the cash register, you're leaving a legacy right there. And that legacy can be changed just like that, by, instead of doing that, going up and say, "Hi, how are you?" And that's the legacy you're going to leave. So we are all in control of legacy. When I worked with HIV and AIDS, cancer patients, people with diabetes, people with God knows what, one of the main things they said to me was that they're all dying, and they don't know what kind of a legacy they're going to leave. And they didn't want to be leaving a legacy, especially with people with HIV. A lot of them were drug addicts. So people with HIV would say, "I don't want my family or people to know me as the drug addict who died of AIDS. They don't know me. I want people to understand who I was rather than what I had." And so I started a program called Legacy because of the way I found out about the things that we do leave a legacy, and that we have control of that. So I started the program Legacy with mostly people with HIV, and then that got expanded to, actually I expanded it to the retail stores, because when you're a customer, or not when you're a customer, when you're an employee and you're working with customers, the legacy you leave about the store or the place you're working in is the legacy that's going to stay with that person. So if you leave a bad legacy for that person who's coming in to buy something, they're not going to come back. If you leave a legacy that's pleasant and whatnot, the store sounds nice, it's nice music, it's clean, it's whatever, they're going to come back. So legacy has to do with almost everything, and that's one of the main things that I've done for the rest of my life. Working with kids with disabilities, I worked with the Department of a program for mental health. I'm a caregiver. I've done so many different things, and now I'm a writer. Go figure. And the whole thing about what I was doing in my life and what I had learned, and especially about death, I found death was the starting point for my book. I lost my father, my best friend, and my next door neighbor who was 90 within 3 months, and I had been their caregiver. So when the first one died, I didn't have time to grieve. So the second one died, I still didn't have time to grieve. And when the third one died, I was a mess. I was, I just didn't know what to do. I was depressed. I had no energy to do anything. I just didn't want to go anywhere. I hated life. It was just a mess. And after about 3 or 4 months of beating myself up, a friend of mine was a psychiatrist, and I talked to him for a while, and one of the things he said was, why don't you write it down? Write down all your experiences. Write down how you feel, what happened, how did that come about? What did, just start writing. And he said, maybe by writing it down will be a way you can heal. So I started doing it. So this book basically, this one here is pretty much my healing experience for the most part. When I finally finished it, I just wanted to get it done so I could give it to my kids, my family, so that they knew who I was. Because even my family didn't know who I was. They knew me as the guy that lived in New York or the guy that lives in Vermont, and he's my uncle or he's my brother or whatever, and that's basically who they knew. They didn't know that I was almost once, or that I worked with so many famous people. I've been involved with, as a photographer, I've been involved with photographing people and working with Cynthia Lennon, Bette Midler I worked with for a little while, and I got to meet some of the most amazing people, and so this book basically became my healing point. And as I started writing, and it was all it was just a whole bunch of pads with a lot of words on it. And what happened was, as I started writing, I started to be curious as to where that experience and how I dealt with it came from. So I started thinking back. So the way the book is written, it starts out in the middle, it goes back to the beginning, and kind of culminates into the present. So it's kind of an odd book to read, but that's how I experienced it. And so writing it, it took me 25 years to write it. Thank God it's done. And the thing that I got most out of it was the fact that every time I thought I was finished, I found out I wasn't. And what happened was, I would do something different that week, or go with a group, or start working with somebody, and I'd see something different, and like I went to, there's a bird museum here in Vermont where this one guy had the patience to carve every single type of bird that there was in Vermont, and he has a museum, or he's dead now, but he has this museum, and all I could think of was legacy. this was his legacy that he left. This will be there forever, or until the earth explodes or whatever. But this is the legacy that he left. He left it. I'm leaving the book as a legacy. I'm leaving this video as a legacy. It's all part of the deal for me. And as I was writing it, I did a program called If I Die Before I Wake, and that was a photo essay that I did in 1992. In 1992, there was a lot of people that I worked with HIV who were, HIV was a death sentence at that point. They knew they were going to die. They just didn't know how or when, and that was one of those things. And working with people with HIV and whatnot, I did a program called If I Die Before I Wake, and as a photographer I photographed people with HIV, and I gave them the opportunity to write a story or write a poem or whatever they wanted, and they gave me permission to use it anytime I wanted to in the future if I did a book or whatever. So, but at the time it was a photo exhibit that went to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. It was in several other cathedrals around the country, and it traveled around for about a year or two, and then it stayed at the cathedral for about a year. And it was really amazing watching people look at this, because most people didn't, at that time, either didn't want to know anybody who was HIV positive, or just didn't know anybody with HIV positive. It always happened to somebody else or somebody else's family. And a lot of it had to do with a lot of people who were HIV positive didn't talk about it. So this was an eye-opener for a lot of people, having the opportunity to read in a very safe environment, see the person's face, and then read their story. And it was very emotional for a lot of people. So they gave me permission to use this, and in the book, I have one section in the book that has their stories. I didn't put their pictures in because I just wanted to keep their confidentiality. Most of them have passed, all of them have passed away since then. So I had to contact their relatives to see if they had any questions about it. And most of them said that they didn't want the name put in the book, so I had to come up with an idea, either use initials or their first name and nothing else or whatever. And then they came to me and said, that's not the problem. The problem is that if somebody knows who you are and they know that story, then they're going to know it was that person, and that they were related to us, and we don't want anybody to know that we had anybody in our family who was a drug addict or who was HIV positive or gay or any of that. So this was a big fear in the 90s, but I couldn't believe that it was such a big fear after the year 2000. It's like I thought we were over this, but I guess not. So I talked to my editor, and she and I talked for quite a while, and she said, well, why don't you change your name? So I took my middle name, which is Eli, and the last part of my last name, which was Shaw, and I thought it looked good, so that's who I am now. Nathan is a boy that I started working with in the high school that he was in, and he has cerebral palsy. And one day, the person who was working with him decided she wanted another job, so they repositioned her to another location. And so they asked me if I'd like to work with him. And he's in a wheelchair, and he was only about 9 years old at the time, 9 or 10 maybe. And so I started working with him, and it became a match made in heaven. That's all I can say. It was just one of those things where we really hit it off. I enjoyed working with him. He enjoyed working with me. We used to play jokes on everybody. It was one of those things, and So I would work with him during the day at school, and when he was done with his schoolwork, I brought him home. And there was a situation where there was another boy that was living at the house at the time, and he had spina bifida, and he had the crutches and all that stuff, and they needed somebody to work with him. So I started working with Zachary, which was his name, and also Nathan at the same time. So I started working with Nathan in the morning. I would go in, pick him up at home, get him to school. I would work with him in school. And then when school was out, I brought him home, and I would take care of them until about 9 o'clock at night. So this was about 5 days a week, and then sometimes I'd go on the weekends and help him out. And so this went on for quite a while. And since then, his father passed away. And after his father passed away, it was a really traumatic experience for him because he was very close to his father. So I sort of became his surrogate father in some ways, but more of a friend than anything else. And since that time, I've been working with Nathan for 25 years now, and he's in his 30s, and you'll meet him later, and you'll understand he and I get along great. He knows all my buttons. He knows how to push them, and I know his buttons, so I can do the same. And but we get along tremendously. We go out to concerts and do different things like that. So it's a lot of fun. And basically, I'm his personal care attendant, but I'm more of his friend. And in the book, I write about Nathan in the way that I've seen so many caregivers do their job, and then that's it. And a lot of caregivers will start working with someone, and as they're working with someone, they don't leave their stuff out back or outside. They carry their problems, their gripes or whatever in with them when they meet the person they're working with. And what I found is when I'm working with Nathan, I'm in Nathan's world and not mine. I have to leave all of my stuff outside. And there are times when I kind of bring my stuff with me, so to speak, into that room or whatever. But Nathan and I have worked together so long that we kind of know how to compensate for that. So that's the good thing. But what I did notice is when I work with people, no matter where they are or what situation they're in, I have to leave all of my stuff, everything outside the door. And when I come in, my job is to work with that person. And so when I come in, I say, "Hi Nathan, how you doing? What's happening?" And we start kidding around, and you'll probably notice when if you see the picture of Nathan, that he just goes nuts when I come in, because I'm sort of like one of the few people who can come in and give him what he needs, and a ride or whatever. I take him for rides and whatnot. He has his own van, and his wheelchair fits right into the van. So we go for rides and go to concerts. And my favorite place to go is Shaw's. Shaw's is a grocery store. So I plan my shopping on a daily basis. So I buy a little bit here on Monday, and then I buy a couple of things on Tuesday. Wednesday we go in, I'll buy a couple of things. Because every time we go to Shaw's, he meets people he knows. And that's pretty much the only social atmosphere that we can find for him. Basically because it's a small town, they don't have that many things. He doesn't go to bars, he doesn't go to different places to eat. So we usually go to Shaw's, and everybody has to go to Shaw's to buy their food. So we end up, we end up seeing a lot of his friends, a lot of his classmates, people he knows. So that's the fun part about going to Shaw's. So But Nate and I have been together for 25 years now, and it's just an amazing experience. I wouldn't give it up for the world. And what I try to tell people who work with people with disabilities is that you have to treat them like human beings, and not afraid to touch them, to pat them. If he has like with Nathan, I roll him over on the bed, and sometimes I'll give him a little scratch in the back, and that's heaven to him. But you always have to ask for permission. You can't do this without permission. And so he and I, we had a touch goes a long way. And unfortunately, I know that there's a lot of fear of lawsuits or whatever. But if you do it right and you do it with the correct amount of preparation for that, it works. And so that's Nathan. It's published by Westwood Publishing. You can get it on their website. You can also get it at Amazon.com. Put in Eli Shaw, and If I Die Before I Wake, A Caregiver's Journey. It's the one with the hands, and it's also the one that says A Caregiver's Journey. That's the one that makes the difference. And if you like it, let me know.